Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to show you how I crosshatch a pinecone. So for this I start with I always want to start a drawing like this with a pretty good contour drawing. And a contour drawing, remember, is a little bit different than an outline where I'm going around and like when I have the graphite, notice how some of the graphite, the pressure is a little bit different and some of the line weight is a little bit darker, and that kind of makes it look a little bit more 3D even just from the start. So the trick to drawing a pine cone is that you don't want to generalize. You want to be very kind of careful to note like the actual structure. And it's kind of got that like inner core, and then it's got the sort of like woody type pieces that kind of are around it. But it has a very unique and interesting texture to it. And it makes for a good drawing. So if you're unsure of like what you should be drawing, this is a good example of just like finding things like that and doing sort of like nature sketch type studies in your sketchbook. And I'm working on gray paper here, and you'll see it by the end, kind of like why that's going to come in handy. So I want to just be observing some of the different textures at the top. There's sort of like that inner part of the pine cone that has that kind of like grid type of a texture. Now, the really important thing that I'm doing in this to make it look most realistic is to think about contrast and having that dark area that's kind of like the inside part of the pine cone. So the way that the pine cone is that the inner part is going to be the darkest, right? Because it's in so much shadow. And then all those pieces that are around it are a little bit lighter, right? So they're still a little bit dark, but they're not as dark as that inner core part. And so by having a lot of dark values, kind of like in the inner part, and then like those other pieces sort of jutting out from there, it's going to look a lot more realistic. As much as possible, I'm trying to get a sense of the texture of the pine cone so that it has kind of a rougher texture, not smooth. So like I'm using the lines and making them a little bit kind of more like jagged and looser, to try to get that texture. And so whenever you're drawing anything with crosshatching, one thing that you're trying to do a lot of the time is get a sense of value. And I've talked about value in a lot of different drawings where you're trying to get a value scale. So kind of like dark areas that are, like the black areas. And then there's areas that are kind of like mid-tone, mid-grays. And then you're leaving some areas that are pretty light. So the way that it works is that whenever you have an object in front of you, the light is going to be hitting it in different spots, right? So the area in front, those are the lightest areas because that's where the light is hitting. And then on the top part, which, I haven't drawn as much yet, those areas are also pretty light. So you don't want to overwork your drawing so much to the point where, it's just completely black and like, you don't have any of the highlights left. You want to try to make sure to keep some of those highlights, but you also want to be shading it such that you get a sense of what's going on, but you're not going over it too much. So it's kind of like a little bit of a balance. Like anytime you're drawing with crosshatching, you're kind of like going into those little like crevices to make it look a little bit darker. So you want to try to, also vary your line work. So, sometimes I'm using kind of more like scribbly type of lines, and then sometimes the lines look a little bit smoother. So that's another thing that you can kind of play around with your drawing. Now I made this other one right next to it, and it's kind of like I wanted just to do a little bit of a different thing. And this one is a little bit more sketchy. And so you'll see just like the difference between one version that's kind of a little bit more of like tightly drawn, the one on the left, and then the one on the right is a little bit more like kind of loose and sketchy. So that's another thing when you're drawing to kind of think about is like how kind of resolved do you want it to be, or do you want it to be a little bit more looser? So it's actually really good for people who are artists and are drawing to work also on just loosening up. A lot of times when people are first beginning to draw, they're actually too tight. And that's because, people are like kind of nervous of making mistakes. So it's actually very freeing to do different exercises where you can kind of just like loosen up your mark a little bit. And I have a couple of videos that are kind of like even more loose than this, like really scribbly type of works. They're called continuous line drawing, and that I'll put in the description, so you can take a look at that if you like. But I think it's very important to practice both types of drawing. The one on the left, which is a little bit more kind of like tightly drawn, and then the one on the right, which is a little bit more gestural and loose. So just try both and see what you like better. Similar to the one on the left though, I'm being sure to make the like inner part is really shadowy. So I'm still kind of going over my lines kind of like over and over again and layering a lot of lines to make them really dark. And that will kind of make it like a little bit more realistic to show that that inner core part is really dark and in shadow. And then all those woodsy pieces are kind of like jutting around. So this is one of those things though where when you're drawing an object like a pine cone, you can get a little bit lost with some of the different forms. But they're organic, so they're, you know, it's kind of forgiving, but it's one of those things where it'll help hone your observational skills to look really closely at a drawing like this. So last thing I'm doing, I'm adding just a little bit of texture back in that one on the left. And what you can then do is go in with a white pencil and add a couple highlights. So for this, I'm just using a white Prismacolor colored pencil, and you don't need to go overboard on this. So just like a couple little highlights can really go a long way. And since you're using the gray paper, that's the nice thing about using a gray or toned paper is that you can kind of like do that, and it just makes it look a little bit more interesting. Thanks as always for watching. If you like the video, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.